Hello, my name is Wendy Royal, and I'm on the organizing committee of the South African Film Festival. The Film Festival is a fundraiser for Education Without Borders, which provides educational opportunities for disadvantaged learners in South Africa and Canada. And this morning, I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Vis Naidoo from Calgary. If Vis can say hi. We have Peter Malakaone from Vancouver, and joining us from Rhode Island is Dave Hemson. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. So I'm sure you felt as I did that the film, The Long Journey of Clement Zulu was very moving and touching, and reminded us of the struggles and the sacrifices of the political activists of that era. I'd like to jump into the first question and ask the three of you, because I know that you were all involved in political activism during the 70s and 80s. If you would tell us a little bit about your activism during those days of apartheid, and also if you were incarcerated, or what were the retaliation by the apartheid regime, if you could explain a little bit about that. So maybe we'll start with Vis.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy, and hi everybody. So my kind of activism started having gone to school and living a fairly sheltered life in an Indian-only area, going to an Indian-only school. And having gone to university, and this is the University of Natal, now called University of KwaZulu-Natal, in the Pietermaritzburg campus. And having got involved in what was a bread campaign at that point in the community, and got exposed to my first sense of what poverty looks like. And that changed my world. I was a science student doing botany, microbiology, and shifted my sense of what is required in society completely. And that's where the political activism started, with the student organizations, the Zanian student organization at that point, and then shifted into the various organizations that were part of the United Democratic Front, the UDF. As a result of that, during the states of emergency, I was detained together with thousands across the country for 2 weeks, and then a few months later for a further 3 months. And I suppose that kind of shaped my world and my thinking, and helped my analysis of society and what needs to be done. So Winnie, I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Vis. Peter, would you like to jump in and talk about your days of activism?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Wendy, and hi to everybody. As everybody knows, I was born and raised in South Africa, and my involvement in politics, it was, I guess you can call one of those things that you just got thrown into because of the environment that you grew up in. And so I was heavily involved in youth movements, and a lot of the youth movements started in church environments, because that's basically where the SADF, as we knew them by then, South African Defence Force, it was a no-go zone for them, as brutal as they were. So they somehow kind of respected that type of, that piece of land. So that's where we did a lot of our politicizing by those students who were probably at UNIS, Vets University and all that. So and we kind of got to understand what the political lay of the land was, and they informed us and educated us about why some of the riots happened, and what our role was as young people at that time. But more importantly, some of the key people that played a huge role in those were people like the late Dr. Ntato Motrana, and also Bishop Desmond Tutu, because at the time his residency was in Regina Mundi, and he played a lot of key roles in what was going on, including people like Mr. Isaac Mokgase, who, together with the other gentleman that I mentioned, They were heavily involved in forming what after then it was called the Soweto Civic Association, which subsequently replaced the Committee of 10, which was one of those organizations which was put in place by the South African government at the time to run the affairs of the community. So that's a nutshell. That was my involvement. But unlike Vis, I was never incarcerated. But I did see jail twice when I was involved with the organization called Sonroba, which I will talk a little bit about as we progress with the interview. And basically, we were stopped, and it was sort of like a quasi-interrogation where we were asked questions like, what do you think about apartheid? So when you're isolated in that environment and you're caught between a rock and a hard place, you have to find a strategy of how to get out there, out of those situations alive, so you can be able to continue the work you're doing.
Right. Great. Thanks, Peter. And Dave, could you tell us your role?
Yes. Well, I was a vice president of NUSAS for international relations, for what that's worth. I would write about the guerrilla struggles in Latin America in the report that I wrote in 1966 and 67. And I warned about the role of the CIA in the student movement. I never been aware of it, but they were heavily involved in politics, even our politics at that time. So from there, I got very frustrated with student politics, both white student politics, because it was really going nowhere. I was organizing all the protests and we weren't making much progress. And of course, we were then in discussion with Steve Biko. I used to spend a lot of time at Alan Taylor. It wasn't all politics. We had some fantastic parties, even Tiki Dry. You won't believe it. Dancing Tiki Dry at Alan Taylor. I couldn't believe it. But it was fantastic. We were very welcome. Although there were huge discussions, people would want to take you apart and, separately and discuss and so forth. So I was very privileged to have many one-to-ones with Steve Biko. And I'll just the insight about Steve. What a gentleman. It sounds the wrong term for Steve. He was a genuine, a real human being in the sense. I don't want to use the word mensch because it doesn't apply. But, I organized a conference on once for NUSAS. And there was BC was rising there, so they thought this was a white student thing, so they didn't participate. But one person participated. You know who that was? Steve Biko.
Yeah.
And by the way, his knowledge. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt for our audience? Could you just say a little bit about Steve Biko
Yes.
and Alan Taylor? Just briefly. The background to Steve.
Well, Alan Taylor was a barracks for Second World War soldiers, right against the oil refinery in Durban. And there was a stench of oil all the time. There was a constant buzz or a roar of the refinery in progress. The atmosphere was suffocating. I mean, all the bad things you could imagine. But it was, oddly enough, it had a happy atmosphere. Steve was a medical student, but I think that was his alias. He was doing politics all the time, extremely bright. I mean, an astonishingly good essayist. He could put words together, and he could also surprise you with his humor, his irony. It wasn't all politics being rammed down your throat. He would tease you out of a position. He would laugh, and you'd laugh with him. Steve Biko eventually formed the South African Students' Organization, SASO, which broke from NUSAS, but it's a long time in breaking, because actually we would meet all the time. He respected us. We certainly respected him. And so, there was that. It was a difficult time. And out of that is where I turned rather towards the workers, towards the abattoir workers in Durban. We had a strike there, and I did interviews with them. And out of that, we formed a wages commission. And from that, we started agitating. Every time we put out a pamphlet, there'd be a strike. The security police were on our backs, but we were calling ourselves the Wages Commission. Sounds so good.
Sounds so good.
From the university. And that gave us a little bit of elbow room for the legal side. I won't go into more details, but it led on to the 73 strikes. When the 73 strikes came, we were well prepared. We had a benefit fund, which already had about 8,000 members. Then the unions were relaunched in Durban. I won't say more than that. I had a short, happy time. I think I had a career in trade unionism for about 9 months before the inevitable. The police came for me. I used to smoke at that time. I tried to burn my banning order. They grabbed me and dragged me down. And the women, the garment union is women, and they were screaming and shouting and trying to pull me back. And anyway, it was all they took me out on the street. They dumped me on the pavement and said, okay, you're never, ever, ever in your life going in there again. So anyway, let me just cut off there. That led me to introduction with MK people. After you had a certificate that you were okay because you were beaten up a little bit by the security police, you seem to have all the doors opened, and suddenly you found another side of Durban. But let me stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. And also, just for our audience, can you explain the term banning? Because that was that was kind of the first punishment, definitely for white people, was being banned, and then it could lead on to worse punishment. So if you could just briefly explain what happened when you were banned.
Yes, it's an extraordinary thing. I wish I could wave it around, but it doesn't look too bold. It's just a piece of paper. But it says there that you'll be given 5 years in which you're not to have a meeting with another person of any consequence. In other words, you could be with your family, but not anything more, as it says in the Bible, where 2 or 3 are gathered together. It's a crime. So you are not meant to communicate. I was banned from the university, from teaching, from writing, obviously from any trade union activity, but almost from any other activity. I ended up selling life insurance with Mewa Ramgovan. I didn't sell a single one because I thought it was a big dirty trick, but at least Mewa was nice to me, and he gave me some compensation for my labor, and I wrote his speeches for him. Our band. He was then doing other things. So look, you are then forced to stay at home. The banning part of it is what I've mentioned. The house arrest is you're not meant to leave your house from different times. I had a tough one. I had to be, from 6 to 6, actually sometimes to 5. If you wanted to travel anywhere in Durban or just outside of Durban, you had to go to the security police and asked them for permission. They said the magistrate, but the police commanded the magistrate. And you had to give a map of where you were going. You had to report all over the place, and so forth. So basically, when I was banned, I had the security police camped outside my house. Well, it wasn't my house, it was Harriet Bolton's house. And they smashed my car. I mean, they do all the right things, What they didn't anticipate is that one of the family actually bought himself a .48 and started to do target practice in the garden. They got a hell of a fright because they thought, we warned them. I said, look, there's a crazy guy here. We're all sane, but we've got a crazy fellow here, and you could just end up dead if you try and come in. So look, it was a tense time, but also full of fun because we broke our banning order. Steve never bothered with his banning order. I mean, he was brave as hell. I was a little more cautious, mainly because family around me would get involved, and they didn't want to give evidence against me or anything like that. So anyway, that was a banning order.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yes, banning and house arrests were pretty frequent for activists, and I remember my own political science professor, Rick Turner, you'll remember him, was also banned and under house arrest. And if you went to visit, you had to go in one by one. You were told not to sit near the windows because there would be stones thrown through the windows. You knew that your name was going to be taken by the police if you were visiting him. So that was sort of the atmosphere. However, that was sort of kind of easy compared with what happened obviously to the three people in our movie, Ibrahim and James and Clement. And Ibrahim in particular talks about being beaten constantly in jail and being isolated from his family and not being allowed to get letters or have any communication with the family. So I wonder if you could also go on from there and tell us there was always a retaliation by the police for those people who were involved in political activism. So could you just tell us your experiences after or what the retribution was by the apartheid regime? So again, Vis, I'll ask you to talk about your stints in jail.
Sure. Yeah. And I think the retaliation comes in multiple ways. And partly the movie reflects that. I was particularly taken by, for example, the constant reference to money and the concerns around how one makes a living. And I think that was certainly important for many activists who were imprisoned during the states of emergency. So I'm talking about short-term imprisonments, a few months, a few weeks, a few years, rather than longer-term being charged and then put into prison. And the other, was a point that I think it was Ibrahim that made was he was fortunate to be alive. And so I think, many of us who were younger activists around the mid-80s onwards kind of, had a sense of bravado and I think youthful bravado, and rightfully so. I think when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out and the different stories started to come out, it was certainly then that I realized the danger that many of us were in without really understanding the full gravity at that point in the mid-80s. So certainly that retaliation by police came in different forms, and some of which we knew and others of which we kind of discovered later. But I think it's important in the context of this film to also recognize that the kind of mental and physical challenges were immense. There were cases where folks were detained for 3 months. You'd be released, you'll step out of the jail, and then you'll be incarcerated immediately back in. Right? So you're never sure what was going to happen during that time that you were in prison. And key to that was really around playing mental games. And hoping that as a result of that, you will crack and reveal whatever you're meant to reveal. And so I think, that side of both the film and also the experiences are quite important, because how you come out of that. And I think the film tried to depict 3 different examples of how people tried to come out of that and whether they were successful or not. So I think that was an important part. And fortunately, in my case, I was surrounded by comrades who were really understanding themselves, had been in prison for many times, and who kind of understood what was required to support the younger activists. And for that, I'm really, really immensely grateful, both in terms of that support, but also the lessons out of it that came through. And during that time, we lost a lot of comrades who were shot and killed in a variety of ways. And you started to get the sense of the dangers. Again, fortunately, youthful bravado kind of took precedence, and we carried on doing what we were doing. But certainly, I think the retaliation by the police, both during and after incarceration, and the effects on family were quite immense, and I think it was portrayed quite well in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Vis. Peter, can you tell us your experiences or those of your friends?
Yeah, it's a very harrowing situation, because especially in the townships where we were, a lot of the white police and SADF, they could not, easily access the people or those who were activists and then know what was going on. So the question of informants came about, where they would be sending the black police or anybody else to come and keep an eye on what was going on, especially in the church environments, because it was a no-go zone, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. So we found ourselves not knowing who to trust when the discussions were happening, how it was being filtered. Then all of a sudden, the SAP the South African police or the SADF knew exactly what was going on. And so which led to one incident where I was hauled into a Protea police station where I was being asked the questions about what my thoughts were about apartheid. And obviously I said it was a beautiful thing because, it put everybody in their place. Otherwise, if I didn't make such statements, I would not be sitting here talking to you today. So it was very hard, and because of that, of those trust issues, and it goes back to what Vis said, it became a question of financial, where people needed to feed their family because they were being paid X number of rents from the leadership of the South African government in its different forms. And but the unfortunate reality also is when those people were found, that's where the term necklace, where they used the car tire with gas, they would, burn people alive. It's a very harrowing experience to see a human being go up in flames like that, in screams. It never leaves your mind, but those are some of the things that kind of hardens you to really deeply understand what the struggles were all about. Mm-hmm. And I think, having said that, I think it's also important to recognize, even within the townships, I mentioned how the church played a vital role in being able to fight some of the injustices. I still remember my priest at the time. He's now currently the bishop, Archbishop of Diocese in Eppington, Bishop Risi. He used to take us everywhere and show us how the white people lived, how the government was run, and he could do anything he wanted and nobody would stop him simply because he was white. And I still remember we were driving from Pretoria after he showed us the parliament. We drove by where they used to hang people every Wednesdays. And he would stop the car there and we would be listening to the screams that were coming out of that. Those types of experiences, they never leave you. And it just, it hardens you. It makes you want to know more and to be able to change the situation. And for some people, it takes them, the wrong way of, okay, we're going to fight everything and hate every white person and hate anybody that's not black. And for other people, because of a little bit of education that we had, it makes you think, how can this environment be improved and be made better? And so then we had the people that were leading the UDF organization in all its different chapters and all its sub committees and sub branches, like the Congress of South African Students. So you start listening to the leadership and trying to bring everything together. And one instant that is still fresh in my mind, I mean, it's almost like it just happened yesterday. It was in 1985, and I believe probably everybody would have seen the speech that was delivered by Zinzi Mandela at Jabavu Stadium, where he read the letter from everybody who were Mandela himself and all the prisoners, saying that they were with everybody else and the struggle must continue. That meeting was supposed to happen at Regina Mundi. And for some reason, the UDF front managed to stop it from happening at Regina Mundi. And there was a very huge delegation of international media. So we ended up at Jabavu Stadium where Zinzi read that message. But after that festival where he talked about where the leadership was saying, how can South Africa have freedom when we're still required to carry the passes? And how can we have freedom when we are still being told where to live and not where to live? There was a very big chaos after everybody was dispersing to go home, because obviously SADF was there. But they wanted to make sure that anybody who could be identified, that they can be followed through and be dealt with. So, and for me, one of the reasons why I left South Africa was, again, I talked about being taken to Protea Station, being quasi-interrogated. I was not physically hurt, but they wanted to see where my state of mind was and what I knew. And the only thing to this very day, I believe, that led me get out of that situation is, if you remember, the South Africa had that conscription campaign. When you're 18 and you're white, you're either going into the military or into ASAP. So the people who were interviewing me, you could tell they were probably still fresh from high school. But there were two barrels of the guns pointing at me, and they were sitting on the other side smoking their cigarettes. And I think they were smoking Lexington, because you kind of knew the kind of smells of cigarettes at the time, and asking me about all those types of questions. And I had to tell them, how wonderful apartheid was. And they asked me I should be working with the government. And that was the only choice I had, because if I didn't work with the government, then they were coming after me and my family. And probably that's the hardest thing that you can ever hear. And nobody in my family was politically active. I was the only one, because I was always the black sheep of the family. I questioned everything, and I wanted to know why things the way they were. So you look at all those, and the influence of the leadership, the uprisings of 1976, and everything else, how it came about to change the state of the country. It's harrowing. It makes you sad that the country as rich and wealthy as South Africa was denigrated, and it went down to that level of separating people according to the color of the skin or what languages they spoke.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. And I think you've touched on a question I was going to ask, but I think you've answered it, that how much worse it was for Black activists and people in the townships. I think, white activists were protected by their whiteness to a certain extent, although, certainly there were people who died, Rick Turner being one of them, but there were some white activists who were killed by the regime. But not to the extent, as you say, that happened in the townships and with the degree of brutality that you experience. Plus, I think you touched on another very good point about the informants and how you were kind of made to distrust each other. That was another level of brutality, really, mental brutality. Dave, could you tell us about your experiences in jail?
Well, I was in and out, just of police cells of different types. Once we helped, we was students from the university on the Wages Commission, helped workers who were boycotting the buses. We gave lifts and used the university combi to run up and down. Of course, we didn't last for long before the police were on our tail, and then they arrested us. But how do you arrest someone with a combi? They made us drive the combi to the police station. And anyway, eventually, I got out. But look, I must tell you, fascinating. We ended up in court for that crime, and we had a brilliant lawyer. He said, "I'm not telling you the defense. All I know is you guys are going to be off in 20 seconds." So we thought, fantastic. So we went to the. I'm trying to think of it. It's halfway up to Pietermaritzburg between Durban, Cato Ridge. All right, there we were in courts there, and all the security police were there waiting to get us inside and to triumph. And our lawyer said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where you arrested these guys?" And the police said, "We arrested them on the road." So he said, "You're telling me you arrested him on the road. Is that right?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I asked for the case to be dismissed because a road is not black or white. It's state property." And the magistrate was so angry. He didn't know what to say. He says, "Why didn't you tell me? We could have had another charge." He said, "No, that's it." And he said, "You people with your long hair and your lack of respect." And he shouted. The magistrate stood up and shouted at us. We were just laughing. And as we left, we said to the security police, "Sorry, you lost, guys." Hey, you're really trying hard. Anyway, we had such moments. You can't say the resistance was just all trana, snot and trana, the tough stuff. We also had many tribes. And, let me just touch on one other thing. I was house arrested. That's a bit tough. It's not too bad in the sense you can get around during the day, or you can slip out at night when they're not watching. My mother loved it. Imagine her son back at home at last. Oh, I never was at home. And now she actually should have to suffer me learning the flute and trying to be a bit musical. So the security police would regularly come to check at 5 o'clock to make sure you're there. They would get hell from my mother, who was a born-again Christian, and she'd read out the Old Testament about how people like them are condemned to hellfire forever, not just for a bit, forever. And are they aware of this? And do they realize that their souls are completely tarnished and that they're never going to live again? And so forth. They would actually be creeping out of the house. But that was my mother. That was also partly living out at beyond Hillcrest, Bothers Hill. It was a beautiful place. So different to the struggle in Allen Payton of people in the docks. I was organizing dock workers there. When we started organizing, you would find that workers would be victimized, but you wouldn't know, because they'd be victimized and taken off the ships and out of town before they would know. Then they'd manage to slip back into town and say, I was victimized. You didn't know, because the police would take them and put them on the train or on the bus to get them out of Durban. So you couldn't even mount a legal defense because you didn't even know what was happening. That was the condition of black workers, at that time. And where we organized, we would have constant raid. We just knew we would have raids. We had raids of the trade union officers all the time. But let me just end on this point. The reaction of others was so important. I was registered for a master's at that time, in African studies. My professor said he had to obey the law. He was not going to allow me on the campus or even see me. So eventually I managed to get him to come to lunch. He came there, he ordered a big lunch, and I said, well, he's going to pay for it. I was unemployed. I was, prohibited from all kinds of employment. He stood back and expected me to pay for the lunch. In the end, I had my last penny to that. He didn't help whatsoever. The Liberals, what terrible people, under those conditions. On the other hand, you would have some people who were actually quite conservative in a general political outlook, but who would stand by you. I should mention Professor Eileen Kricker, comes from Afrikaans family. She came and visited me, and she gave a letter of support and so forth. Whereas, the other so-called liberals at the University of Natal just didn't bother to show any help at all. But the librarians at the municipal library in Durban, the reference library, they would see the security police coming. They would tell me to quickly go and hide in the loo, and they'd say, no, they've not seen me. So you'd find ordinary people would protect you. On the other hand, people who should have stood up, it cost them nothing to stand up, would enforce all and inflict all the difficulties on your head. It was tough times, they made sure that everybody who could be on their side was on their side. I have to mention one other last point. The person who did all the firing in Durban was J.B. Buthelezi. It was Buthelezi's uncle. Gacha Buthelezi knew everything about the oppression of workers. He didn't lift a finger. And that was from 1972, he knew that. And when I worked together with William Kanyele, an MK person who came off the island, and he told me that he'd been instructed by ANC to go to the Nkata platforms. Well, there wasn't Nkata then, but to work together with Buthelezi. I explained all this to him. He said, look, Dave, I've been told to do this. I know it's against my better judgment, but I've been told as an MK fighter to go and stand on the platforms of Nkata in 1975. And we're still living with the consequences of that. Let me stop there.
Okay, well, that actually segues into my next question. I mean, the major theme of the film was the three men's release and reintegration into South African society. And two major themes seem to come out of that. One was, which has been mentioned before, I think Vis said it, the financial difficulties that the men faced. And the other was the heavy toll it took on the families. Clement Zulu obviously had the hardest time because he it came from KwaZulu-Natal, and at that time in the early 90s, they were in a battle between Inkatha, which Dave has just mentioned, which was the party led by Gatsha Buthelezi, who was the head of the Inkatha movement, and the ANC. And so they were in a vicious conflict. And so Clement Zulu, being an ANC member, found that he was, as he said, going from one prison to another. Vis, were you around at that time? Could you just talk a little bit about the ANC Inkatha struggles and why it would have been so difficult for Clement Zulu to reintegrate into his home village?
Oh, yeah. You know, it's been a simmering process around the role of the Inkatha Freedom Party and the role of the ANC in terms of when it was banned. And the Inkatha Freedom Party kind of tried to assume the role of the ANC as the internal organization within the country, including some of the colors of the ANC as well. And you know, I think the point that David made around the ways in which the exile community decided to approach Inkatha Freedom Party, you know, may have been different to what the experiences were in the country. And I think in the 1990s, after the unbanning, that became very evident, or more evident, especially around in the context of Pietermaritzburg, around what was called the Six-Day War, where the running battles in townships like Mbali, Edendale, to a lesser extent Sobantu village in Pietermaritzburg. It led to, you know, a group of lawyers coming in and trying to identify statements so that could be taken to court as well, and to show the evidence of the collusion between the Inkatha Freedom Party and the state apparatus at that point, and what is described as a third force. So I think all of those experiences certainly would have made things very difficult for Clement Zulu in the context of coming back to his home town, which was very much in the heartland of the Inkatha Freedom Party stronghold, and his family around there. And even going to places, I think it may have been Newcastle, Escort, if I can't recall, you know, even those places as well, it was very strong. So I think that level of trying to reintegrate into society and find that the politicization of society along sometimes cultural lines, certainly along ideological lines, was very strong. And, you know, and even folks who are not political but felt that by virtue of being a family member to somebody who, like Clement Zulu, who was in prison for trade union work, became an ANC member, and then, you know, that immediately raised conflicts. And as was noted a couple of times in the film, it was really around, you know, him feeling very threatened to go back to his hometown, and the ability to get his wife and children to be with him. So it led to really challenging social situations, family situations, and it led to people dying as a result of that.
Yeah, thanks, Vis. I was impressed by something that James Mangy said during the film. He said, "I know it's absurd, but sometimes I miss prison." Do you want to just comment on that, Peter? Could you kind of explain his mixed feelings? Obviously, hating prison, but also having a hard time reintegrating into the society.
Yeah, you know what James talked about, Miss in prison, there's that camaraderie amongst the inmates. they become your brothers or sisters, and because you're so isolated and you're removed from your family and what you used to know as your social environment. And so it becomes hard because, and there's routine in prison. You know what to expect at what time and what the process is and what the rules are. But once you come out of that, especially for a lot of those Black activists, you look at the environment that they were going back in, what they fought for. The situation is still the same, or even in some cases far worse than what they left it when they went into prison. So to come back into that, yes, you are a hero. Yes, you fought for all the right reasons and for the right things for the community, but the resources are not there. And I think part of it also, it could be attributed to the legacy of apartheid, the educational system. I mean, I still remember when I grew up there, we had 4 different types, actually 3 different types of educational system. And Vis and Dave can comment on that. We had the Bantu education, the Indian education, and the white education. And towards the late 80s and all that, then the multiracial came about, where now all the other the leadership kids could go together to schools and all that. So, and when you look at the Inkatha situation, it gives you pause, because these were the vehicles of the apartheid system that were used to oppress the people, hence the homeland stance. I mean, Buthelezi, he's a polarizing figure. Like him, hate him, and the people that love him, they'll tell you how fantastic he was, and those people that don't, and that they'll tell you all the atrocities and the brutality that came about because of his reign. And when you look at his shift from being the cultural leader of the Zulu people, and when ANC now started taking traction and being recognized, and changing the Inkatha into a political party. So, and that's where you find all these clashes happening, because now he was funded, like all the other guys who, whether it was cis guy, trans guy, or Bupu Tatswana, where the Bedis and the Tswanas were sent. These people were funded by the government, no different from what we have here with the indigenous people, these, what do you call it, the reservations, because that's where the concept came from. So when you look at that and how these people were able now to be able to monopolize what the new system was coming to be, and everybody else are favoring ANC, and them wanting to be part of that because they've always been in the country. So it becomes very, you're polarized. You don't know sometimes what side to take, because you look at what the ANC was trying to do to change all that, saying, I mean, there should not be any homelands and all those types of things. Everybody should be able to live freely wherever they want. It threatened the leadership. So the leadership of those other groups like the Inkatha, of course, you have to flex your muscles and show your followers that I'm still the leader, and this is what we're going to do. And because of the lack of education or information about what the real political democratic world is all about, the followers tend to listen and believe and do whatever the leader says. So hence you have all these clashes that are happening, and you can see how hard it was for Clement to go back into that environment, because you are not one of us, because you don't subscribe to the same beliefs that we have as an Inkatha Freedom Party, and you're viewed as the enemy. And so it becomes very hard for him. So obviously, even though you're trying to fight for the right things and the justice and everybody being on the same page, as far as the freedom concepts are concerned, you are fighting in the wrong arena, because those people believe what they believe, and they're going to do what their leadership tells them, and you are not part of that equation.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for that explanation. I'm going to shift, because we are starting to run out of time, to the present and ask you your opinion of the current South African leadership. Do you think the current ANC leadership has betrayed the Constitution and betrayed the ideals of the anti-apartheid activists, including yourselves and the work that you did and what you stood for in those days? Dave, could you tell us what you think?
Well, look, I'm looking at it from a trade union workers' perspective. Towards the transition, we had a textile industry with something like 45,000 workers employed. Those workers, particularly the women from the Valley of 1,000 Hills, my home area is Embo, and they had jobs at the frame factory. The frame factory employed something like 24,000. It is no more. The ANC, as soon as it got into power, it didn't carry out reforms like were taking place when the Workers' Party came to power in Brazil. Of course, it made huge reforms and putting black people instead of white people in key positions, fine. But the actual reform that was taking place was to open up the floodgates to imports, to do away with all the protection of tariff barriers. And instead of victory, we had mass unemployment almost immediately. In the docks, we had privatization. You know, under apartheid, at least it was a full-time job. There is casualization on a huge scale in Durban. The compounds have been smashed down. They're turned into luxury hotels now. And there's not a single black person who's a worker in the docks actually living on the point anymore. It's all luxury apartment now. I mean, it's a revolution of inequality. And I don't know where the word liberation comes to play here, because for ordinary people, this is not... Well, I just have to share with you that some people close to me have committed suicide. They cannot get jobs. They find that their world is not expanding. I cannot think of one person who can tell me honestly now, my life has improved in the past 30 years. Now, it's not a message I want to carry out to sell to Canada, to America, or anything, but I have to tell the truth. And in other words, the word betrayal, or maybe I'm not sure what was in the DNA of the ANC leaders. Were they really liberators to take out the struggle, or were they already, before they even got into power, in collusion with big business and all the rest of it? Because that's the way in which has happened. Our trade unions are fighting, but unfortunately they become business unions rather than fighting unions. We have difficult times in South Africa, and despair and discontent. I mean, can you imagine? I know Transnet. I'm organizing Transnet workers, even though I'll be going back in Durban in November. Only 10% of the rail system in South Africa is working. The docks in Durban have been privatized. They've been sold out to a Filipino company. Oh, my God. What happened to all our state-owned enterprises? With Eskom, it's crisis after crisis, and it's 1 trillion rand debt. That's been, although there's less electricity generated than before. Look, sometimes it tears in my eyes when I talk about it, because we could have done so much better, and it's not happened. And I have to put the responsibility on people who actually had the command. Even Thabo Mbeki is standing now. He said, "Yes, look, mistakes have now been made." But Thabo, go back to the fact that I was expelled from the ANC for expressing the views that I had of a socialist vision for South Africa. I was expelled in Dar es Salaam, and then not being able to participate. I was being excluded from all the major trade unions. The trade unions I helped form, like the Dock Workers Union, I've been not allowed to participate in that. Now it's all changing, but the times have changed, and we're now looking to see. Well, I don't want to go into a whole socialist spiel, but I do think that working people have to organize themselves to be able to put a different vision for society of a genuine non-racialism, not multiracialism, not a sense of every group fighting for itself, but actually for us all, the majority of society, society, 99% is working people. The tiny percentage which actually really own property and own big companies in South Africa are at the top of society. They are not part of, of the vision of the future. They've given us a bad deal, and we have to restore our faith in our society.
Thank you. That's very depressing. Vis, do you want to add anything or comment both on what Dave said and your own ideas of either the betrayal or if anything good has come out of the last 30 years?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think in the movie there was comments around the optimism that the folks felt upon being released from prison and the unbanning that took place, and the fact that there's an opportunity to reconstruct society. And clearly, a lot of that did not happen. I think for me, it reminds me of three things, again, at a fairly high level. One is the role of leadership. And we know that both in terms of many people's writings, and we experience that daily. And clearly we can see the role of leadership and the fact that any organization is never monolithic, and that everyone's jockeying for different types of power within an organization and for different reasons. And so for me, that was one of the clear manifestations where the role of leadership within the country at all levels didn't really manifest in the context of the ANC's, as the governing party, the ANC's mantra around how do we create an equal society, how do we build South Africa. So that's one key part. The second key part is, I think for many of us in 1994 or 1990 and going up to 1994 and after, we almost felt a sense of relief. We now have a government that's democratically elected, that reflects us as a country. And for many of us who were involved in different kinds of civil society organizations, kind of pulled the foot off the pedal and didn't keep that kind of community-based support, pressure, engagement to the level that it was during the early 1990s and pre the unbanning of the different organizations. And I think that was perhaps a fault on reflection, that we needed to keep that level of engagement, that level of pressure, so that the change that we wanted could have started to manifest itself because of that groundswell. I think that the third kind of part to this around where we are currently and the future is really, I don't think we appreciate the influence of a range of actors. Everybody from the mention of the business world and the fact that there was political freedom, but there was never economic freedom. And I think those things were levels of freedom that never really came together. The external influences, the influences within the organizations, whether it's ANC and other organizations, and the different ways in which, whether it's ideologically based or whether it's just pure, how do I get to access the resources of the state? Whatever the basis was, there was a lot of jockeying for the right kind of power. And so I think that level of influence, I think, is only starting to, we're only starting to understand the gravity of it within the country. So taking all three of those, I think the challenge we're facing in terms of where we are right now in South Africa and where we are and where we're going forward. And I'm saying this very, very aware that I'm living in Canada and very, very aware that I don't experience things on a day-to-day basis that other folks, whether they're family and friends and others, experience. But really what in my view is required is a relook at leadership within the country at the political level, at the level of different key industries, whether state-owned or otherwise. The ability to reignite that fire around community engagement, community taking control and building things. And I think there's that's an important aspect of helping South Africa build again. And I think there's a role to play around how do we help bring the right levels of education back into the country, and we help build that component of it as well, because I think that's going to be a critical part. We recognize that in the 80s and early 90s, and I think we need to see how we can make that better again. Thanks.
Thanks, Vis. Peter, I'm going to give the last word to you because we're going to have to wrap this up pretty quickly. Do you want to add anything to what Vis and Dave has said about the current situation? And also maybe leave with us, do you have any hope for the future of South Africa?
That's a big word there, Wendy, hope. I mean, Dave and Vis, I think they summed it up well. And I like what Vis said about, yes, political freedom have been gained, but has truly economic and freedom been gained? To me, that's one of those big questions. I look at it and I truly don't know what the answer to that. My personal being, again, like Vis being here, you look at it, you're thinking that has not been achieved. And it goes back to the leadership. What was the mandate? And what were the expectations? What was the plan to be able to achieve those, the mandate, and make sure that the outcomes were as planned? And I mean, I could bring up the example of the South African Airways. I still remember the first time I flew on that. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my whole entire life. The second and third time I flew on that, it was like, what in the world is this? And so you could see, again, it comes back to the leadership. Who's leading these organizations? Who's leading these entities? And it led to a very huge, big problem in my mind, that the class structure. We knew it was always there, but the haves continue to fatten their pockets and look to protect and raise their families and make sure everybody else is well taken care of at the expense. And again, it comes back to what David said about the trade workers doing all the work and not being able to be adequately remunerated for what the work they were putting in. So is there hope? Only time and history will tell. But when you look at the current structure right now, what's going on, when your young people aspire to being the DJ as a professional, and the whole country is looking at that, it makes you wonder, because you're looking at other countries where now they're looking at, we have to produce more people who can find a way of taking us to the moon and finding out what's going on there, more doctors, more professionals. So it's very, very hard. Yes, I understand the economic plight we're in right now. You have the load shedding and everything else. But where is South Africa going right now? I think we are heading for more darker days before that light can come through. I was talking with a friend of mine who we've been heavily involved in these types of things back home. And she was informing me that the mayor of Johannesburg was voted in by the councillors, did not finish high school, has no educational background. So how do you become the leader when you don't even have the basic concepts of what leadership is all about, and to take the community, the city, the district, the country to where the great leaders like Mandela left the platform, and to take it to the next level. So it's heartbreaking. So what the legacy is going to be, there's part of me that hope and wish that we could see a good change happening in our lifetimes, but there's still a part of me that thinks probably it won't happen in our lifetime. It's going to take many, many more years, because there's so many mistakes that have been done, and it's going to take a long time than we expected it would, because there's so much work that still has to be done to make sure all the right pieces are in the right place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. Just before we wrap up, would anybody like to make a final comment, either to each other or about the film, before we say goodbye? I think we've covered it.
Well, since I was on deck, I would just close it up on my part and saying, I mean, the film is a real reflection of probably today's South Africa, what's happening. I mean, there's a lot of good things that are happening, but I think they pale in comparison to all the hardships and all the other things that still have to be done. So hopefully, I mean, they can continue being ongoing education and collaboration amongst different sectors to try and turn this ship, because right now the future it looks very, very glim.
Thank you. Dave, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to sound a little more optimistic in the end. I've given some hard facts, and I think Peter and Vis have also added to those. But I do want to say, look, I love my people. I really do. And when I go back and I go out to Embo, and the people I don't know, but they remember my mother, that white lady on the hill. They used to go and get advice for her, and really they don't shake hands, they embrace me. You know, that's home, man. That is my home. And with all the difficulties that we've got, there's love, there's affection, there's a common culture, which is actually deeply democratic, despite all that is said. And there's also a vision that we've got to work together. We've got to work out, you know, our problems, and particularly among working people. I can say that among black and white and among all people, people are realize that actually we have unity. We are working together despite all the odds. And that sharp, nasty, ugly part of apartheid, that personal hatred at times from white to black and so on, actually it's diminished. I don't. I might be living in a cloud, you know, in myself. I don't see it. I get the warmest affection, and I feel the same affection to the people that I've helped in the past, where I've worked together in the past, and I feel we actually, despite all the mess, we actually going to pull it through.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave. And
yeah, just a quick one. I just think, you know, having talked about education as a very important component that we need to always keep building. And I just want to point out that the work of Education Without Borders is quite an important part of making that small, modest contribution. But I think it's still a contribution that we need to make sure that happens all the time as we keep building different generations at different levels of knowledge, education, and through that leadership is going to be key. So I think, you know, things like the film festival, groups like Education Without Borders are quite key to help that process of rebuilding.
Thanks, Vis. And just finally, if I could say a word, just through my work with the film festival, I've got to know, and also through some of the great documentaries I've seen, I've got to know some really amazing young Black people who are doing amazing things and are creative filmmakers, business people. And I know that those people could not have survived under apartheid South Africa. So I think that's in itself is a step forward. There is a lot of talent there, as long as we can get rid of the current leadership perhaps, but under apartheid, those people would never have had a chance. Their creativity, their intelligence would have been lost. So I feel hopeful in that way, despite all the corruption, the economic hardships, and everything else that we've talked about today. So let's go forward and keep that hope going. And thank you all so much for joining me this morning. Well, it's morning for me. I don't think it is for Dave, but it's been wonderful having this discussion, and I'm very grateful that you were able to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers, folks.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah.